Blue skies and rooftops from Boston, I see from Carol. Welcome, Thyra, Many Labs. Judy from Vermont, a frozen Connecticut river. Calling nothing remarkable. Thanks for calling in. We'll wait a couple more minutes and have a few more folks join before we get started. Welcome, Nikita. I hope I'm saying your name right.
Yes,
welcome, David. Great to have you. Also, Gray Skies from London. All right, we got some Europe representation. Welcome. Thanks for calling in and waiting. Welcome, Maria and Tracy.
Hey, Lindley.
Great to see you. As folks are joining, you can share where you're calling in from and anything you can see outside your window in the chat box. Welcome, Nikki. Welcome, Maria. Good to see you. Sarah says, from Richmond, California, my cat trying to hunt bugs in the garden. That's probably a pretty humorous sight. And Cecilia, snow. Got a lot of snow on the call right now. Welcome, Monica. David says, Kellen from California looking at some beautiful forests with small birds flitting around. Thanks, David. We'll wait one more minute and have folks join. Again, if you're just joining, if you want to share in the chat box where you're calling in from and something that you can see outside your window. Okay, last chance. Anyone who just joined, if you want to share where you're calling in from in the chat box and something that you can see outside your window. Got another New York, East Harlem, buildings, gray sky, and bare trees. And from Chapel Hill, rainy woodlands. Beautiful. Okay, let's get started. As folks continue to trickle in, welcome everyone. My name is Lindley Meese, and I'm really excited to host this third in a 5-part dialogue series entitled The Underpinning Stories. A number of you have been on previous webinars, but for those that are new, this series is really about grappling with some of the assumptions and frames that underlie decisions about and really drive where and what kinds of climate solutions get funding. And my colleague Jesse will be chatting a blog post that describes these 5 frames, so you can read a little bit more about the arc of this series and what we're exploring. And in terms of the framing and the context, we're in this moment of polarization, both politically and also particularly in the climate space around strategies. And there's often a recognition in philanthropy that we are not doing enough and that perhaps what we're doing are maybe the wrong things. So in the spirit of learning, we're really trying to create a space for emergent and honest conversation where we can really push our collective community of practice around what our assumptions are and what we might be able to learn if we expose and share those assumptions with each other. And although we're focusing on climate today, really these frames touch all of philanthropy, but climate is particularly important because it introduces all sorts of complexities around justice and urgency. And as many of you probably know, less than 1% of philanthropic funding goes to climate, which is really disproportionate with the scale of the problem. And although in this conversation, I believe, and I think that the speakers and all of us share more similarities than we do differences. What we're here is to really suss out how we might hold different viewpoints, and that's what we can learn from each other. As Maria Popova, one of my favorite writers, recently wrote, questions invite instant opinions more often than they invite conversation and contemplation. So in this spirit, this conversation is less about being right and what we know, and more about learning and listening. And I'll be doing my best as the facilitator to point out some of those differences. And we're really honored to have an incredible set of speakers with us to dig into measurability and evaluation and feedback and all things metrics, and how that framing shapes the field that they each respectively are in. Actually, I'll have them wave after I take out off the screen share. So I'm going to do a little bit of ground rules, and we'll meet each other, and then I'll introduce the speakers and we'll dive in. So first, I want to, as much as possible, if you can put on your video during this conversation, so it feels less, for the speakers, it feels less like they're just talking heads on a screen, literally, and more like this is an active conversation. And towards that end, we're going to have a really active chat box. So if you see down, if you haven't been on Zoom before, you'll see on the bottom kind of bar of the screen, you have an option to click chat. And throughout the conversation, you can chat reflections and questions and comments that you have. And we have two amazing chat box monitors, Jesse and Veronica, who are going to be tracking that and feeding those into the conversation. And that has been really generative and active in past conversations. So thank you so much for doing that, and really looking forward to more of that this time. We also have tech support. Carol, her name is Carol at Grassroots International. And if you have any tech needs, you can chat her during the conversation and she'll do what she can to support you. And then finally, a quick note on confidentiality. These are, anyone can sign up for these webinars. So if you're media, welcome. And we ask that this is off the record. So if you have any questions or you want to be speaking directly with the speakers, you can reach out to them individually. But we ask that this conversation is able to be as emergent and honest of a conversation as possible. And then finally, for those that are new to this type of platform, really taking an opportunity to unplug from all of the other things that your screen can have on it. So closing down your email and other distractions, and being present for this conversation as if we were in the same room together. And get whatever you need, grabbing a beverage or a notepad or whatever you need to be present, and taking a couple breaths as we get started. So to give us a feel of who is in the room, Sam is going to, who is supporting us, is going to throw up a quick poll. So Sam, if you can throw that up there. There we go. So this first one is just to get a sense of who's in the room, and it's not a multiple choice. And I know many of you probably wear multiple hats, so just choose the answer that feels best suited for this conversation, so we can get a sense of who's in the room. All right, so it looks like we have definitely most people are from institutional philanthropy. Got a few, one individual philanthropist, welcome. About a fourth of us nonprofits, and one interested public. Awesome, welcome. Cool. The next poll is, I want folks, actually, if you are comfortable, to close your eyes for a second and just take a moment to notice when I say evaluation and metrics, what comes up for you? Just taking a moment to notice, what is the kind of first feeling that emerges when you think about evaluation and metrics? And then same if we could throw out that second poll. In a moment. There we go. So if you could vote on what is the first emotion that came up for you? Obviously, probably a number of emotions came up for you, but just getting a sense of people's immediate reaction to evaluation metrics in your body. Interesting. So we have about half of folks responding with curiosity. And then we also have a pretty significant percentage responding with fear or frustration. Just taking a moment to notice that and being with that. That's going to be with us through this entire conversation. Both fear, frustration, and hopefully some curiosity. Great, thank you. So now, before we dive in, we're just going to have a quick moment to meet some other folks in this room and orient around why we are all together in this space. So if folks, Sam is about to put us into breakout groups, and you're just going to have a really quick 5 minutes to introduce yourself to the other folks that you are in a breakout room with. And for those that haven't done this, you're going to receive a little pop-up window that says join a breakout, and you're going to click yes. And for those on the phone, you'll be automatically pushed into a breakout group. And you're going to share your name, any affiliation that you feel moved to share, your gender pronoun, and then answering the question, what brings you to this conversation today? What are you excited about? Why are you here? So just, quick 1 or 2 minutes each, sharing who you are, and why you're here in a breath. Okay, Sam, I think we can push.
You are unmuted. You are now in a breakout session.
I'm up here in conversation about why you are in this conversation. Corinne, excited to talk about the elusive metrics of power. And please mute. Yes.
You are muted.
Sam, if we can mute everyone, that might be helpful. For folks that are coming back, quickly sharing in the chat box something that you're excited about this conversation. Why are you here? John, the challenges of attribution and evaluation, particularly with advocacy funding. Yeah. Let's hear a couple others in terms of what brings you to this conversation. Learn how others frame their work and approaches to measuring progress. Capacity building, evaluation. Who decides to get measured, evaluated, and in what time frame? So we got both the kind of meta questions around why and also the more tactical questions of how. Okay, so let's get started. Now that we have a better sense of who's around the table, I'm going to introduce the host of this webinar, the CLIMA Fund. CLIMA is a collaboration across 4 international grant-making organizations towards grassroots climate work around the globe. Global Greengrants, Grassroots International, Thousand Currents, and Urgent Action Fund for Women's Rights. And CLIMA, what we do is we raise and re-grant funding for women, Indigenous, and youth-led work confronting root causes of climate change and also building local resilience across the globe. And we're really a fund for larger funders to be able to make big investments in grassroots climate solutions. And also working collectively because we have distinct strategies across those 4 organizations to provide a continuum of support for grassroots movement building around the globe. And you can learn more, I'll say a little bit more at the end, and you can learn more about us online. We're really excited to welcome a fantastic lineup of speakers. We have PeiYao Chen, who is the VP of Impact and Effectiveness at the Global Fund for Women. She's been wearing that hat for over 10 years, working in gender justice and philanthropy fields, from academia to nonprofits and foundations, always working at that intersection, and we're really excited to have her expertise with us today. Twersky is the Director of Effective Philanthropy Group at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can hopefully see them. Give me a second. There we go. PeiYao, if you can wave so people can see you. And then Faye, who can also wave, is the Director of the Effective Philanthropy Group at the William Flora Hewlett Foundation. She helped and launch and shape the team since 2012, which guides strategy, evaluation, and organizational learning within the Hewlett Foundation. And she also leads grant making to support organizational effectiveness overall and more broadly. So really excited to have that perspective here at the table as well. And then we also have Peter Kostishack. Peter, if you can wave.
Hi.
He is the Director of Programs at Global Greengrants, where he helps administer thousands of small grants to grassroots movement building organizations around the globe each year. And he's played a whole suite of roles over the last couple decades in supporting Indigenous peoples and land protections, and very excited for you to bring those perspectives to the conversation today. Thank you, Peter. So as we dive in, I'm just gonna have one more plug for the chat box. As we get started, if you could please type in, when you think of evaluation, what do you think of? Really just wanna hear as broad and as deep, getting a sense of what are the orientations and the kind of mindsets that we bring to evaluation here on this call, so that we're having a conversation as a collective around those themes. For the speakers, I would love for you all to, we're gonna kind of go through and introduce yourselves, and would love to share, for each of you to share what a story from your political or professional journey that drove you to focus on our evaluation, or drove you to have the orientation around evaluation that you do. In the case of Peter, I know that's not your main gig. And for you, why this is really critical work. And if you want to, pepper in a beginning of your approach to evaluation at your organization, that would be helpful, but we'll dig a little bit deeper on that next. So PeiYao, I thought I'd start with you. If you can share a story and your approach.
Sure. Hello, everybody. So I think my story is more personal, started personally. It took me 3 years to finish my dissertation, and probably less than 10 people read it. So in a way, I was drawn to evaluation because of the practicality and utilization end of it. I think it can, when designed and used properly, it can be a powerful tool to facilitate learning and use the information to inform planning and to change the way we do business. So I think the utilization side of evaluation is what attracted me to this field.
Great, thank you. And can you share a little bit about your approach at the Global Fund for Women to evaluation and metrics?
Sure. So I think we, at Global Fund for Women, we have, I would say, 3 key main audiences for evaluation. Number one is our donors and supporters. We are a public foundation that raises money annually. And then the second audience will be our internal audience, which is our board and staff. And the third will be our grantee partners and advisors. And depending on the audience, we try to answer different evaluation questions, ranging from what outcomes have we achieved with donor support, what impact have we created, how are we performing as an organization, what's the accomplished, what worked well, what didn't work well, how have we implemented our strategies, is it the right strategy, and how and I think I said this, how are we performing as an organization. Right now, I would say because of limited resources and because there's a need for fundraising, I would say the allocation of resources in terms of meeting the needs of the 3 audiences is quite uneven. We spend most of the time, the majority of our resources, in trying to meet donor requirements, donor demands in terms of evaluation, focusing on the results of our grant making, focusing on what we are learning. I would love to kind of shift the balance to create more balance between the 3 audiences. In the past 2 years, we have increased resources and effort in thinking about organizational learning, creating systems and processes to create real-time data to look at our organizational performance. And one additional area that we would love to spend more time on is engaging grantees in defining what indicators, what measurement matter to them, and measure them accordingly. I think that's some, and sharing more information back to grantees on the kind of learning we have generated and what we are learning across the board. So I think those are the 3 areas that we are focusing on, and right now it's a little bit unbalanced.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that, giving us the broad sweep and also the aspiration. And would love to, in a moment, dig a little bit more deeper into where those aspirations come from. Faye, I'd love to turn to you if you want to share a story of why evaluation is important to you and how you ended up here, and a little bit about your approach at Hewlett.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So there are many stories, as there are for all of us in our lives. I'm not going to start with my origin story for how I got involved with evaluation. Instead, I'm going to share a story about a really key inflection point in my career. So this was in 2006, after working on evaluation and strategy in a variety of capacities for 18 years. I was invited up to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to help them start a new team, Impact Planning and Improvement. And the idea was that the foundation wants to be more systematic in its approach to strategy and measurement, and also hearing from outside voices. And I had spent a fair amount of time on strategy, on evaluation, on monitoring. And when I got up there, it was challenging to figure out, how to put in place a process for strategy development, also to develop systems for what we were calling actionable measurement. But the piece that was sort of the most unique, new, a little bit vexing to me was, how do we hear from outside voices? Just wasn't sure what exactly that would look like in terms of the puzzle of the work I was going to lead there. And then I had done some work to help the foundation hear the voices of grantees through the Grantee Perception Report, primarily with the Center for Effective Philanthropy. But I thought there was still more to do to help the foundation hear from outside voices that weren't just the hum of our own expertise. And one day I was sitting in my office and I had just a feeling in the pit of my stomach that we were really far away from the people that we were seeking to help with our funding. We were vesseled up in the beautiful Pacific Northwest and doing work all over the country, all over the world, trying to help people improve their lives and opportunity. And I had just had a very strong intuition that the voices that we really needed to hear were the voices of those we were seeking to help, to benefit with our funding. And so that really led me down a path to work on what I now consider the third leg of the measurement stool. So, we're talking, and even in this conversation, about monitoring and evaluation. And the way I think of those two legs of the stool is evaluation being third party, independent, dispassionate look at your work. Monitoring being what organizations themselves do to track progress according to what's meaningful for them. And then feedback is really the third leg of the measurement stool, which is laser focused on the people, communities, citizens, the people that we are ultimately seeking to help with our funding. And since that time, I have been kind of on a mission to help create rigorous, authentic feedback loops so that nonprofit organizations and funders can benefit from the insights, preferences, ideas from the people and communities that we are seeking to help with our funding. So happy to talk more through the conversation about why I think that's important, how it has actually found expression in the work, how it is both rigorous and also authentic, and can be incredibly meaningful and transformative to organizations who actually listen.
Thank you, Faye. Really helpful to get a sense of the framework that you use and how you're building in another leg to ask different questions, and curious to dig more into the practices in a moment. Peter, I'd love to finally turn to you to share a story and a little bit about your framework at Global Greengrants.
Yeah, thanks, Lindley. I think for me, a story dates back maybe 12 years ago or so when I was doing some work with the MacArthur Foundation and their conservation and sustainable development program. And they were very interested in how they could grant more and support the work of indigenous peoples in the Amazon basin. And, obviously a big foundation with a lot of established bureaucracy and process. And so maybe kind of building off of what Kay said, we I created sort of a feedback space. It was a focus group with some of their grantees, but also a lot of indigenous leaders from the region, and to talk with MacArthur's staff. And there was something from that that still, I think, sticks with me and informs a lot of just the questions and the challenges I have when I look at evaluation. And it was an indigenous leader from the Amazon, from Ecuador, who was one of the founders of the Amazonian indigenous movement in that country, also of COICA, the Amazon-wide group, so a real elder and a visionary. And he said, not specifically of MacArthur, but of foundations in general, he said, the problem is that your log frames have nothing to do with our cosmovision. And I'm paraphrasing a little, and but that juxtaposition of this term log frame, right, which we're all familiar with, and then cosmovision, if you work with Amazonian peoples, you're familiar with that it's actually incorporates a lot of things, from spirituality to traditional knowledge to how people look at how their work and the work of the ecosystems and the spirits and the animals are all connected. And it just dawned on me how far apart we were on this. And I thought, from the perspective of MacArthur, here they're trying to preserve the Amazon, and they want to work with indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are really responsible for protecting 20% of the Earth's land area, 80% of the biodiversity, and we're not even close to the same plane in how we're working. And so we're missing out. It's no wonder indigenous people receive so little foundation funding. And so I guess moving forward, just flashing forward maybe to about 6-7 years ago, when at Greengrants we really took a deep look and developed our current learning and evaluation framework. Our goal here is really about supporting social movements. We believe really in the power of social movements and bringing about long-term and lasting social and environmental change. And we also understand that work happens, social change happens within complex and adaptive systems, which means that we can't work on traditional, 1 year, even 5 or 10 year timelines. They're often generational. That change is not linear. That setbacks are actually a part of the work all the time, and we see that very often. And I think this came up in the comments and in our small group, that issue of attribution is nearly impossible. We're talking about movements. We're not talking about one organization or a single person bringing about change. We're not saying that our support to something really was responsible for that change. And so we were trying to think, well, how do we approach this when there's so much that can't be counted or measured with that work? And what we decided to do is we really looked at what specifically we view that social movements do in order to leverage power, and really try to understand that. So, first of all, they create infrastructure, networks, they mobilize resources through that. They can exchange knowledge, ideas, monetary resources, strategies through these networks. We looked at how do we measure that or understand what's happening. Also, movements are really important in reframing debates and changing the terms of debates. So we look at that, and movements take advantage of opportunities too. When there's a political opening or some opportunity for change, that infrastructure is there and movements can act. And another piece that we've looked at a lot is how movements really provide platforms of leadership for non-traditional leaders. A big issue with, of course, the environmental and climate movements, that there are all sorts of very important actors that traditionally haven't been represented in the leadership. Youth, women, Indigenous peoples also. And so could we be looking at how movements are strengthening through their leadership and who we're supporting as well? And so for all of those, we've developed our own indicators. We're not saying that we can necessarily measure or even predict the change that will come out of that, the work of those movements. That's another aspect of complex systems. It's the outcomes aren't predicted, but at least these indicators help us understand that we're making progress. And then we also do some really deep dive evaluation work where we're looking at a particular issue in a place over time and what's changing. And that sort of work really helps us test our own assumptions too, which I just listed a bunch of them. So it's definitely a work in progress, and we're still learning. I'm really excited also to hear from some of the other examples here.
Thanks, Peter. That was really helpful. You brought up a lot of, as you said, assumptions and also really important pieces around what type of measures and indicators are important for changing or tracking social change over the long term, and movements that are building power, which are just really big and very important questions that I'm hoping that we get to. One thing that strikes me is that some of what you started with, PeiYao, is different from what Peter was just describing, that you do at Global Fund for Women have more quantifiable and set metrics that you're using to track and report back to funders. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about why you take that approach and what you've learned over time, in particular, going to Peter's point around challenging and changing assumptions, what you've learned and what you've changed over time in terms of your evaluation because of what you're learning about what and how you're using them. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. So I think about 5 years ago, we started to look at the more organization-wide learning and evaluation framework. And we built on, so we updated our theory of change and adapted this concept developed by an organization called Gender at Work that looks at the power structure. So for Global Fund Women supporting grassroots women-led organizations and their movements, I think we conceptualize social change in 4 domains, that it's important to create change in all 4 domains in order to create long-term social transformation. So at the individual level, it's about increased awareness and agency. It's also about individual access to resources, services, and information. At the system level, it's about both policies and laws, and also the informal domain, it's about social norms. So all 4 domains need to work together in order to create long-term social transformation. And we find that framework really useful to think about the types of change our grantee partners are seeking to create. And they are not linear. They are kind of 4 dimensions of equally important things. So we use that framework to think about our grant making, to think about capturing the change our grantees are creating. So for Global Fund Women, we kind of approach, we created indicators along those 4 domains because each year we award about 300 grants, and it was more. It was 500 5 years ago. So we're talking about volumes. And in order to understand in a given year how our grantees are the kind of change our grantees are creating at the aggregate level, we needed a kind of organization-wide, more kind of larger framework to pull them all together. So to help us understand what's happening. So that's kind of the approach we took. We didn't ask grantees to select indicators. We asked them to provide reports, and we do internal coding based on the framework and the indicators. So it's the burden is on us to do the coding and to kind of generate to see the patterns, to generate analysis. I think if we were making fewer number of grants and with the capacity to do more deeper analysis, to do different kinds of evaluation, we probably wouldn't choose this approach. So it's based on needs.
Yeah, nice. I heard a bunch of things there, and one of them is kind of the 2 levels of what is important to evaluate for ourselves, for funders, and what's important to evaluate for the folks that we're attempting to support and serve. And I'm curious, PeiYao, you mentioned that you had some aspirational aims at the Global Fund for Women in terms of what indicators you would be tracking for them, and also how you would be conveying that information or giving that information back to the communities that you're funding. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about the aspirations and why you're making that switch. Or that addition.
Sure. I think I think we have been asking grantees to provide a lot of information. Grantee reports, sometimes we follow up with interviews. We are asking a lot, and I think it's best practice actually to provide information back to them on what are we doing with their reports, what are we doing with the information they have provided. I think that's the feedback loop that we need to create. I think another thing is we would love to do more with engaging grantees in defining what indicators, what measures matter to them. This requires time, resources, and capacity to be able to think about what's important, what information do they want to know, do we want to know, and how to measure them. I think take Global Fund for Women, for example, when we started to think about internal learning. What do we want to learn? What do we want to learn about our internal practices? What do we want to learn about how we perform as an organization? It took us more than a year to identify the indicators that we can track, and that means something, and that's meaningful to track. So I think that requires some kind of really required investment to help grantees to build that internal capacity in order to engage in that kind of thinking and define what indicators and what measurement matter to them. I think it's easy, and I think it's frustrating for a lot of people that a lot of evaluation focus on things that don't matter. Evaluation provide information that you already know. So I think we need to propose alternatives by defining what matters to us, and what matters to us as Global Fund for Women, what matters to grantees as the organization might be different. And I think that's the part of defining what matters. It's important.
Yeah, I hear what you've seen in philanthropy around patterns of funders either self-fulfilling prophecy, hearing what they believe already and only listening for what they already believe, or not actually taking in and receiving the information that they're getting, and that puts on the onus on us and the responsibility on us for really tracking what's important and what is important to the folks that we're supporting and funding. Yeah, I appreciate that. Faye or Peter, do you have anything that you wanted to add or ask about, or maybe something in your practice that's different from what PeiYao was just describing?
I can just build on that. I really like and understand what PeiYao is saying, and that I mean, at the heart of evaluation is this concept of value, and we value different things depending on where we are and what we're trying to do. And you know, MacArthur might value this indigenous group's work for protecting a particular forest because it's important for biodiversity, and that community might value it for spiritual reasons, right? But more above that, and so, and I think that that's okay. That we have different values as long as there's spaces for conversation. We definitely do, you know, there, like Global Fund, we do some, have indicators that we've established ourselves that we're trying to track that really feed to an underlying theory of change, because we're global. I mean, we're funding in 100 countries a year, and you know, we only have so many resources to invest in learning and evaluation. But we also do these deeper dives, and we have found some really, I think some of the greatest learning has come from processes where we involve grantees in groups, or at least within communities, having a lot of community members involved in really discussing what has changed because of this work, because of the funding, but also just their own organization, what's changed. And that's where the the contribution versus attribution is really important. And then we have conversations that at the level of our regional program, where we have advisors who themselves are environmental leaders and activists who are looking and sharing those stories that are coming from the ground among each other, and looking at a regional perspective and saying, well, what's been important about this? What has changed? And then we look at that globally too, in terms of staff. But it's not to say that what was important at one scale is more or less important than what we see at another scale. It's just understanding that there are a lot of layers of meaning in this work, and then to the extent where we can communicate that back, and I think that's always like PeiYao is saying, that's a real challenge. I mean, we're working in so many different languages across large distances, but we're trying to do that. We're getting better, but having that communication flow so people understand is very important at the local community level, to see how my efforts are housed in a larger movement, or that has larger significance at the national and regional level, because that's how that work really grows.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I particularly appreciate your describing how the process at Global Greengrants is relational, and that it's this, if we're working globally, having folks on the ground and up really communicating with each other and having deeper relationships to communicate the story, and not just the acres saved or whatever the metric is.
Just to add, stories are a huge part of the learning and evaluation that we do, and that's I would say it's a fundamental way in which we learn as through stories and observations, and from growing up. And so I think there's a lot that we've been able to glean through stories, including in a global grantee survey that we do every few years. It's also longitudinal, and it's in 7 languages and goes out to hundreds of groups. But we ask for stories in there, and we code them. We pull information from those stories.
And you mentioned the multiple layers of meaning, and I wanted to toss it back to you, Faye, talking about feedback and the importance of listening to grantees and those we fund, and to Peter's point around there's different ways to see the world, there's different worldviews, and often as funders we're taking one of those worldviews. So to truly listen, we must there's a lot of things we must do. I'm curious if you can talk about your process at Hewlett, and what are the ways that you've learned to actually listen and be receptive to and porous to other ways of thinking and understanding the world.
I'll answer that, and also just weave back through to some of PeiYao and Peter's comments as well, and also just paying attention to some of what's in the chat box, try to weave a few threads here. So we're a little different than the 2 other speakers in the sense that we're a large foundation. We also do fund all over the world, and we have, we probably make over 800 grants a year and have at any given time close to 2,000 active grants in our 6 or so different program areas. So just to set that context, we have worked hard to not have our monitoring work be the kind of indicator tracking that is bureaucratic and burdensome and late and not meaningful, with no stories. Like all of the stuff that can happen with big foundations and indicator tracking, we've tried to avoid that. So we have gotten really clear and have guidance for all of our programs about what we consider monitoring, which is progress tracking. That's okay. Is what we call implementation markers. So there are many different ways that people track indicators as outputs and inputs and services and so forth. And we have developed our own taxonomy for anything that is meaningful to you to track over time, or even just over the next 12 to 18 months that will tell you if you're on track, if you're seeing the progress that you expected to see, or if you're not. Collect that limited data set. So we aim for a limited data set rather than a maximum data set around any kind of implementation markers. And those markers could be work that we're doing, it could be work that our grantees are doing, it could be short-term outcomes, it could be context, things that are happening in the context that will matter to our work. It could be what we call tripwires, that is, how will we know if we need to really stop? We fall on our face and we need to really take stock. So there's many different types of implementation markers, but we've tried to kind of get away from the jargon, like to Peter's point around log frame, that is sort of deadening for people. So that's sort of on the progress tracking. It's very much about learning and making course correction in real time. On the evaluation work, we have also tried very hard we don't evaluate everything. We evaluate those parts of the work where we have the most curiosity, where it will be most influential to our ongoing considerations and decisions. And the best kinds of evaluations that we do engage our grantees fully. So I'll give you just one example of that, where in one of the portfolios that I lead, which is in our philanthropy portfolio, that is, we try to strengthen the field of philanthropy. It's a little meta, but we have a strategy called Knowledge for Better Philanthropy, and we support 13 organizations in that portfolio that in a variety of ways produce and or disseminate high quality knowledge about how to do philanthropy well. And we knew that these organizations produced high quality knowledge. We had assessed it for quality. We knew that they had distributed a lot of stuff. You know, their reach was broad. But what we didn't know, and what really they didn't know, was whether any funders were really paying attention to the knowledge they were producing. Were funders reading the stuff they were producing? Was it influencing their decisions? Was it influencing the things that they tried in their foundations or their philanthropic efforts? And so we invited all of our portfolio or organizations in that portfolio to join us in basically trying to get an impact. So do funders actually know who these organizations are? Do they read the stuff they produce? Do they take in their ideas and try them out in their foundations? And we involve the grantees at every step of the way. From initial conception, we invited a group to participate in selecting the vendor who would do the third party work with us. We had an advisory committee that it wasn't just us looking at the interim reports and deciding on methods. It was a whole advisory committee. About 5 of the 13 volunteered to participate in the advisory committee and read interim reports, help interpret with interpretation. And then at the end of the process, we not only had a report that spoke to whether the philanthropic sector actually does pay attention to these organizations and the knowledge they produce, but we also gave each organization back their own individual report that compared responses about their work with the other 12. It was anonymized, so nobody could see what exactly was said about the other organizations, but they could see comparatively how much they were known, how much their stuff was read, how much their materials and knowledge made a difference to funders, and they could see how they compared with others. And of course, comparison is a little bit the coin of the realm in evaluation. So just to say the major finding is that the funders did actually read a lot of the work that came out of these portfolio organizations. They did try out some of the findings. They did try out some of the ideas. But what was interesting about that study, that evaluation, was that funders who were surveyed in this process said they don't typically go to the source for that knowledge. That was kind of interesting. Like, they don't actually go to one of those 13 portfolio organizations of ours, which was a little upsetting to those portfolio organizations, but they do what you and I do, which is they call up their peers. So if they want to know, what should I think about in terms of governance? They might say, hey, Peter, what should I read about governance? I want to fix my board. And then hopefully Peter sends them to a good source. Board source is a great source for that, or somebody else is a great source for that. So funders call their peers, and hopefully their peers do send them to these high quality knowledge products, which we do know actually happens. That finding, that insight, which seems so simple and common sense, was actually super helpful to these organizations. In fact, Aaron Dorfman from the National Center for Responsible Philanthropy wrote a blog saying, finally, a foundation commissions a study that's actually helpful to its grantees. So that was like the sign that we actually had done a good job of involving our grantees, because he doesn't shine anybody on. So anyway, that's just a little bit of a story of how we distinguish between monitoring, which is what we do to track our own progress in ways that are meaningful and not so burdensome or bureaucratic, and then evaluation, which is done with a third party and ideally does involve grantees. I would say on the feedback realm, we are still, I would say, earlier on in that journey. We're committed to doing more listening and doing more systematic and rigorous listening. But I would say we're still on the beginning part of that journey.
Thanks for that, Faye. Yeah, appreciating monitoring being something that funders do, and a key part of that is real-time adjustments and learning. And then evaluation is something that a third party does and deeply involves the grantees, and what you describe as a pretty intensive process in which the grantees were so highly involved that they were learning from each other and comparing to each other as well. I'm curious to turn back to PeiYao or Peter to share if there's anything that you found that's different in your process from that, and why you might be taking a different orientation.
Difference, you mean difference between
different practice or different orientation around where and when to involve grantees, for example? And if nothing is pinging for you, I'm curious to hear, to go to Peter, because you mentioned this differently. It was a meeting, and Faye was just speaking about how evaluations, that's still a nascent part of their journey. And I'm curious if you can share a little bit about Global Greengrants' orientation to feedback and what you've learned from grantees that's changed your practice.
Yeah, sure. You know, I think it's important as funders, we recognize the most important evaluation that we do is actually before the grants are given, right? And so we, you know, on our end, we use a network of advisors who really know the context and the movements and essentially make the grant making decisions for us. So there's a very strong local knowledge component in there. But that also is useful for us because it provides more of a mechanism for feedback. So we can't have staff all over the world, but we do have 150 volunteers who are in contact with groups, and it's often rather than strict evaluation or monitoring, a lot of it we would call accompaniment or mentoring, because these are grassroots groups and they really rely a lot on the advisor, the same person who recommended the grant, to be coaching them or helping them, connect them with decision makers or other resource organizations, other sources of funding even. So nothing that we're funding is really happening within that vacuum. I will say that we also have, I mentioned a survey that we do with grantees, and we do a sample of it. We can't, I mean, there are just way too many, like Hewlett, hundreds, at least over 800, 900 grants a year. But we do ask, and we spend a significant part of that survey, and again, we have to do a lot of this through interviews over the phone because these groups aren't able to fill out surveys or they don't respond to emails. But we ask about their experience with Greengrants. So what's been your experience in getting the grant? Was it how burdensome was it? Was it timely? We ask about their experience working with the advisor, so the person who recommended the grant, and what sort of other assistance did they get. So we're really starting to get a broader picture of what's happening from the perspective of the grantee. The other thing we're starting to ask now, and it relates to what I said earlier about setbacks that we see so often with social change work, we're starting to ask very much in detail, particularly within the context of closing civil society space, what sort of setbacks groups have found, whether it be restrictions on their receiving funds, it could be threats, it could be criminalization, could be violence, and we're finding at least half of our grantees are experiencing something like that. And that's very important for us, both to inform our work and understanding, and we also ask, are they using our funds to deal with these kinds of problems, because that's not always in the proposal too. But I think it also is helping us understand just the challenges that grantees face in trying to do the work that they're setting out to do.
I would add here, I mean, the way that, and I don't think I answered this part of your question, Lindley, the way that we do this sort of parallel to what Peter described is every two and a half years or so, we contract with the Center for Effective Philanthropy. In full disclosure, I'm on the board. But we did this before before I joined the board and before I was here. But we do the grantee perception report, where we survey all of our grantees to get a sense of their experience working with us. And we share those results, not just internally and not just with our board, but also publicly. They're always posted on our website. So anybody can take a look at any time on the Hewlett Foundation website and see the feedback. And it's disaggregated by program, so you can see how each of our programs is doing and how the grantees experience different programs. So, and we do have different experiences across our different programs, and that's pretty interesting. So those are opportunities for us to learn from each other. Where is one program having a better experience with grantees, where the grantees are saying they would come forward to talk to us if that problem arose? To me, that's the most important question in the survey. But also other indicators of the grantee experience, and other programs having a less good experience, and we can learn from each other and help inform improvement in that vein.
Thanks for that, Faye. Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of conversation in the chat box about the merit and the need for using third-party evaluators, and I think that's an excellent example, Faye, of where you all have decided that to really have honest and transparent self-evaluation, third-party is necessary. And I'm curious, PeiYao or Peter, if you have what your practices or perspectives are on third-party evaluators.
So I think we engage third-party evaluators, I think for two reasons, and that has been discussed before. One is to create a space to create space for honest feedback. I think when we do internal evaluation, there's always a positive bias that grantees want. There's always a desire to tell donors positive news, that donors are doing a great job. So I think that's one, creating a space for honest feedback and kind of more objective analysis of the data. And I think the second thing is kind of do third party, because we are sitting in San Francisco and New York. I think having a third party evaluation on the ground to better understand, going deeper into better understand certain areas, the contextual analysis, diving deeper into specific analysis. I think those are something we don't have internally. So I think having external capacity to support that was quite useful.
Nice, cool. Thank you for that. That's helpful. And I have two more questions I want to throw out for you all. First, throughout the chat box conversation, there's been a lot of dialogue around the hindrances and the problems and the cumbersome nature of evaluation. And I'm curious if you all can just talk a little bit about what are your frustrations. I think it was like 20 to 30% of the folks on the call felt frustration in their body when they thought about evaluation. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what are your frustrations. That's for anyone.
I think for me there are a couple of challenges that that I see with a lot of evaluation. The first is that it's very hard to really understand. You just can't measure the contribution that the grantee groups are bringing to this work. And I think we just so undervalue that tremendously. And so we say, oh, the grant allowed this to happen. But when we think about that local knowledge, that investment, that political and moral authority that local groups will have with this work, all of that is, and then of course the huge amount of effort, the volunteerism, the other resources mobilized towards this. I guess we just can't do that justice, but I think it's just something we want to recognize. But I think the other part that is really for us a challenge is understanding that and it's just those openings of opportunity and the role that they play in actual successes happening. So it might be a political change. So we're seeing in South Africa right now, there's a lot of advance going on and closing down coal plants and starting to look towards a renewable future that happened because of a change in politics, right? In other places, it might be tragedy. It could be a cyclone or something that gets people thinking about resilience and how to rebuild, and that our adaptations have to keep moving forward and forward because our environment, our climate is constantly changing. So, but those sorts of moments in time, those key opportunities really are very, I find frustrating they don't really get represented very well in kind of typical evaluation methods.
Thank you for that. And that is a really nice segue to the last question I want to throw out in the space for anyone, which is you bring up kind of the critical, when we take a frame of climate, we're in a moment where we must, we do have a sense of urgency. We do have a sense of, wow, we need to be taking action in so many different areas. And at the same time, we're having a conversation about evaluation, which is about slowing down, which is being thoughtful. And we're also, it's been peppered throughout this conversation. I think Saura brought up the point at the beginning that valuation can also be about power building. And we're talking about shifting, and we have the assumption that climate requires shifting the systems that we exist within. What does that mean for evaluation and the practices that we need to be infusing in all of our organizations within the context of climate? So that was a very long, lofty question, but I think it's very simple to what are the practices that we need to shift in evaluation because of this climactic moment that we're in and the systems change that we may or may not be after.
So I can start. I mean, I think some of this, every field is unique in some way, and then there are ways in which it's not so unique. So I mean, if I walked around this whole building and I talked to the climate folks, and they would have their unique interests, and then I talked to the performing arts folks around the corner, they would have their unique interests, and then education is a whole other kettle of fish, and global development and reproductive health, another. So every field has its own unique content, constraints, opportunities. All of that is really true, and it is true for climate too. But I think actually a lot of the issues that you just went through, Lily, about climate, evaluating climate-related issues are the same for all of them. That is, you want to be sensitive to what's the problem you're trying to contribute to solving. How are you going to try to do that? What are the key assumptions underneath? This is all of what PeiYao was talking about in the beginning. What would be useful for you to know? What are the questions? Can you actually articulate clear questions to guide your evaluation or your monitoring? Those are the sort of coin of the realm for any feel, and that's true for climate too. I think what is particular and tricky and complex around climate is, for us anyway, some of the policy advocacy work and coming right up to the line of what's legal to do, and then you have to pay a lot of attention to those questions of legality in the evaluation as well. So I would say those become complex quickly, and especially working in countries where there's issues around closing civil society and how do you evaluate work rigorously without potentially causing harm to people. I think those are real dangers that can come up in more politically sensitive areas. So I think that is true. But in addition to that, I would say that the most important things to bring in terms of changes are a learning mindset, not an accountability mindset, but a learning mindset, I would say. Really, really matters a lot. And then one of the things, this relates to your last question, that I'm always pushing here internally with our folks, our program staff, is to be a good client of third-party evaluations. Because having been on the other side, I was an evaluator for 18 years before going inside of foundations. And you know it, if an evaluator can only be as good as the client who's engaging them or her. You really need them to pay attention to make sure that the questions that the evaluator is setting out to ask are in fact the questions that you want answered. Lots of times, you get to the end of an evaluation and somebody will say, as PeiYao said in the beginning, well, I already kind of knew that. Well, maybe they didn't pay enough attention to the questions that they were framing at the beginning. So paying attention and paying attention about the data collection process, all of that, being a good client, whether you are in a nonprofit seat or a funder seat, matters a lot. It will, because evaluation is a real world a research endeavor. It's not academic where maybe a few people will read the report. You really need to engage in real world questions. So be a good client.
Thank you, Faye. That's helpful. And PeiYao, Peter, do you have anything else you want to add? And I also want to bring on Cheng-Hua mentioned, specific to the climate sector is the tension between carbon counting and people's equity issues. And maybe either of you can speak to that as well. Thank you. Okay.
I would like to add on to what Faye just said. I think climate justice situates in the kind of social justice and human rights field. I think there are some commonalities across different issues that can apply, that it's fundamental to the monitoring evaluation we do, especially for those of us who support grassroots organizations and their movements. I think monitoring evaluation need to focus on power, challenge power relations, and also movements. I think these are quite similar, even though climate justice has specific issue-focused contextual context, but that I think is quite similar across the board, and focusing on the power relations, challenging the power structure, and the movement strength. I think that's important.
Thank you, PeiYao. So hearing the when thinking about climate justice specifically in that intersection of climate change overall and equity, we need to be thinking about power relations in evaluation. And Peter, lobbing it to you to talk maybe a little bit more about how evaluation could be part of that power shifting and not just supporting power shifting.
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to also pick up on Cheng-Hua's point here. With climate change, really the metric that matters has to do with emissions reductions and carbon sequestration. But of course, we all know that that inextricably tied to that is the issue of cost. So as foundations that are limited resources, we have economies that are changing as a result of the decisions that we make around climate change. And so there's always that underlying thing, okay, emissions reductions for the least investment or the least cost. But what we're not asking, I think, in general in climate philanthropy is who's paying those costs. And that is the essence of the climate justice problem, I think. And so there can be a lot of great ideas and great solutions that will reduce emissions and even have some other co-benefits, but it's forest peoples who end up paying the greatest cost for it, or it's the people who get displaced by massive industrial wind farms in Mexico or whatever. And so I think that that's really important, that we take it beyond the metrics of emissions and then the cost per emissions, but really understand who's paying for that, and really the inequalities that causes. And I think the way to do that then is exactly what Faye had said earlier. You got to bring in a diversity of perspectives into this work and really understand, even if those people aren't the direct beneficiaries of the grant making, if they're involved or impacted, then those perspectives need to be brought into the evaluation of the work. And then I really loved what Faye had said about intuition at the beginning. And to me, that it's critical. There are a lot of ways in which we make decisions and innately make good decisions too, that aren't based on measurement or metrics or things that we can actually tangibly put on a chart. And intuition is actually a really key force that we have to understand and respect. And sometimes we don't have time to do a full evaluation. And particularly intuition is important when we just feel like Faye said earlier, when something's wrong, that somehow we're only talking to the same kind of people, or actually all my grantees are run by white men, or there are things that just jump out and bug us, and those are great areas then to start to question and really understand, okay, this is a problem, something needs to be changed. I don't really know why, I can't prove it right now, but it deserves looking into more deeply.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, hearing it is about carbon and thinking about who actually bears the cost of those changes, and to mitigate this, and when taking the assumption of that, the importance of diversity of perspective that are at the table. And in the spirit of that, would love to transition to having more perspectives in this conversation through small breakout groups. And we're gonna do, because of things got juicy and exciting, we have a little bit short over time. So we're gonna take about 7 minutes to be in a breakout group. You'll have smaller groups of 4, if that's possible, Sam, to have a few minutes each to reflect what you've been hearing, what's exciting to you. I'm going to pull up a slide with a couple of questions. One moment. Okay, so in breakout groups, some questions that you might wrestle with are: what assumptions did you hear emerge in the conversation? How your views might align or differ, and then what is one way, if at all, your understanding of evaluation or metrics has shifted. So we're gonna be in these breakout groups for 7 minutes, and then we're gonna come back together for a final go round and closing out. All right, Sam, take us away. Welcome back, folks. As you are rejoining the call, please take a moment to share any highlights from your conversation in the chat box so we can cull and harvest some of the insights that emerged. Give folks a couple minutes to write those in. Welcome. So for those that are joining, take a moment to share a highlight from your conversation in the chat box. So you can see on the screen, and I'll take us off screen share so folks can see each other. Smaller group now. Just sharing one highlight from the conversation that we can take away. From Andrew, there's a desire to see models and actual evaluation questionnaires being used by progressive, equity-minded funders. Does that exist? Carol, more than measuring carbon adaptation mitigation, also about power to frontline communities and just transition. And Kathleen, we should stop trying to measure the impact of individual grants, but rather think of the big picture. This takes a burden off of grantees and also gives us more meaningful picture of philanthropic impact. And Peter, how does the dichotomy of mitigation, adaptation, and related measures detract from more fundamental solutions to change systems? Which comes back to Chung-Hwa had a comment before we all broke around resiliency, and when funders focus just on resiliency, what does that mean in terms of looking at all of the other ways that folks are organizing for systemic change in people's solution? And how is that limiting our perspective? So opening up to what are the questions we're asking about long-term organizing and evaluation? From Hillary, how to measure impact in a way that leads to local solutions being scaled. And Veronica, I think it's important to hold the conversation of evaluation hand in hand with the conversation of donor education and advocacy in order to bridge the gap between qualitative and quantitative metrics and indicators. Here we are. So I know we're at time. I'm sorry that I didn't have a moment to give our speakers a last word. But thank you so much for joining us. We'll clap for them in a moment. I just want to do a quick shout out. Our next conversation is on February 28th at the same time, same place. We're having a really stellar group of 4 speakers. It's going to be a juicy conversation. And so please join us for that. You will receive an invite and a reminder. And thank you all so much for participating. I'll be doing a roundup after via email. And as we all leave and sign off, Sam, if you can unmute us just so we can do a round of clapping for our speakers. Thank you for joining us. All right, see you all next time. Thank you, Faye, Peter, and PeiYao.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.